Hello everyone, my name is Deepankar and today I'd like to tell you a little bit about creating surreal imagery with convolutional neural networks, which is commonly referred to as deep dreaming. Now, before we get into the meat of our presentation, I'd like to give you a little sneak peek of the kind of images that we'll be talking about. So in the middle, you can see a nice white dog that doesn't quite just look like a nice white dog anymore. There's a lot of interesting intricacies and details in that picture now. And the same can be said for the picture of the orange cliffs on the right or the picture of the seaside on the left. So in order to really unpack this topic properly, there's four important concepts that we'll have to understand together. The first of these concepts will be convolutional neural networks. And the second will be how these neural networks are used to recognize and identify images. The third of these will be how this process is then reversed or remixed in order to create the kind of surreal images that we are talking about. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about aberrant salience, which is commonly referred to as psychosis, and how the kind of research that's being done here can have some important implications in that field as well. Now, convolutional neural networks are basically a model of the human brain using complicated mathematics involving a lot of statistics. You have a set of inputs and you want to get to go from that to a set of outputs reliably every time. And one example could be a set of images that you want to be able to caption correctly every single time. You'd have a layer of neurons, which are essentially complicated formulae that link the inputs to the outputs through a bunch of layers. Obviously, if you have more layers, it means that your model will be more reliable each time it sees input that it's never seen before. So figuring out a picture has been a classic challenge for AI scientists and researchers. And in this case, when we apply convolutional neural networks, the input layer would be the content of each pixel. And then for the output layer, it could be a multiple choice of different possible captions. And we see a good example of this in this rather colorful picture of a bird, which is put into an input layer, which would be an array of its pixels. Then you'd have a bunch of hidden layers, which would have their kind of formulae or neurons get adjusted through training. And eventually this would lead to the output layer, which in this case, you'd have to correctly choose bird by putting a 1 there, for example, and putting a 0 in all of the other options. But a bunch of researchers came along and basically said, what if we did a dissection on this model of the brain that we have in this neural network? And what they did was kind of look at how the neural network, actually understands the image. For example, when it tries to understand the cat, what it does is that with each layer, it's successively enhancing details within the image, getting more and more dense in its internal representation of this cat. And it's through this density of representation that it's able to finally figure out that yes, this is a cat, not a bird, not a fish. But if we look at the intermediary kind of stages, we'll see that the output gets quite augmented in the sense that it's a kind of a surreal version of what that cat used to be. And this is kind of the building blocks for how we achieve deep dreaming later on. So essentially what we do is we break up the image that we are looking at. And for each section of the image, we tell the model to, identify what's in that section. And then we repeat this process many times to get the deep dreaming effect. But obviously, since we're looking at sections rather than the whole image, the details that the model finds might not, actually be details that exist. So it's essentially hallucinating on top of this image. And we can see examples of this. For example, in this example of the virgin and the child, with each successive, increasing of the number of repetitions of deep dreaming that we have, the image gets more and more distorted. But the interesting thing to note is that the third image isn't just a more distorted version of the second image. It's distorted in completely novel ways. For example, the background, instead of having these boxy artifacts, the model has started seeing all these eyes or spirals instead. And that's an interesting phenomena that's even more pronounced in this second example, where the second image only had 10 repetitions, whereas the third image had 20 repetitions. And yet with the second image we see that there's a lot more areas of the image that got distorted. For example, the background is pretty distorted, so is the gun, which is almost turning into this creature of sorts. Whereas with the third image, it's mainly the head of the woman and that general area which has received a lot of artifacts and a lot of distortion, whereas the background is relatively untouched, and so is the gun. And so we see that this isn't simply like, applying an artistic filter like you'd have on Instagram. There's a lot more going on here. And to understand why that's important, we gotta look at the broader artistic context. For example, these were a set of paintings by a patient in a mental asylum. You can see that he's representing how he experienced his psychosis by taking an ordinary painting of a cat and successively making it more and more distorted and deranged. And this is kind of where deep dreaming's broader contexts or broader implications fully become clear to us. Because if we think about schizophrenia as a medical condition, what it essentially does is it results in a detachment from reality, which causes the psychosis. And this detachment is said to be caused by a breakdown of your higher brain functions and the feedback systems that these higher brain functions control. And if we think about it, this is exactly how we cause an ordinary convolutional neural network to give us incredibly distorted and surreal images that it was not originally meant to do. So what some researchers believe is that we can model possible cures for schizophrenia or for psychosis by playing with the deep dreaming process, adjusting certain parameters here. And what they really want is to understand why certain noise gets emphasized over other noise. And we saw this even in the example images that we had. Even though we increase the number of repetitions, suddenly some parts of the image were less distorted than others. Why does this happen? And if we fully bring the model of, or like the analogy of the deep dreaming process to the human brain or towards psychosis, then we can really understand how we can try and inhibit certain hallucinations and kind of alleviate the general condition of a schizophrenic or a psychotic patient. And there's further work that can be done in this field as well. We could extend the deep dreaming process to other mediums like linguistics or even music. Obviously, like the recent generation has been quite fond of rather surreal music. Tastes have been exploding, and you'd get a double harvest of benefits basically, because from an artistic perspective you'd really be pushing the limits and kind of exploring new fields, and you'd also be providing some findings in terms of how you can help people whose conditions mirror the deep dreaming process, and kind of provide findings and takeaways for the mental health medical field. So yeah, that's me for today, and if you have any questions, do let me know. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.